Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Friday, 14 November 2025. It is the 164th anniversary of the birth of Frederick Jackson Turner, who was born in Portage, Wisconsin on this date in 1861. Turner is most famous for formulating what is now called the frontier thesis. Turner read his paper, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, at the meeting of the American Historical Association in Chicago on 12 July 1893 during the World Columbian Exposition, and Turner included his paper as Chapter 1 of his 1921 book, The Frontier in American History, which expanded on the frontier thesis. The frontier thesis should be divided into at least two distinct claims. Namely, that the existence of the North American frontier was constitutive of the American character, or the American identity, or whatever you prefer to call it, and that the frontier had since closed, and with unknown consequences for an American character shaped by the frontier. The first claim, that the frontier shaped the American character, is the more familiar idea. Quote, the existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, and the advance of American settlement westward explain American development. Behind institutions, behind constitutional forms and modifications, lie the vital forces that call these organs into life and shape them to meet changing conditions. The peculiarity of the American institution is the fact that they have been compelled to adapt themselves to the changes of an expanding people, to the changes involved in crossing a continent, in winning a wilderness, and in developing at each area of this progress out of the primitive economic and political conditions of the frontier into the complexity of city life, unquote. As one of the central claims of the book, it appears and reappears in many guises throughout. So here's another take on the same theme. Quote, American democracy was born of no theorist's dream. It was not carried in the Sarah Constant to Virginia, nor in the Mayflower to Plymouth. It came out of the American forest, and it gained new strengths each time it touched a new frontier. Not the Constitution, but free land and an abundance of natural resources open to a fit people made the democratic type of society in America for 3 centuries while it occupied its empire, unquote. We can find a perfect illustration of this in Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, when Huck says, I reckon I got to light out for the territory ahead of the rest, because Aunt Sally says she's going to adopt me and civilize me, and I can't stand it. I've been here before. I've been there before. Also in America, we retain the expression, time to get the hell out of Dodge, which implies there's always a road out of town and someplace further down the line where we can escape from the trouble we've gotten ourselves into at the moment. The second claim in the frontier thesis Turner made as he ended his original lecture. Quote, 4 centuries from the discovery of America, at the end of 100 years of life under the Constitution, the frontier has gone, and with its going has closed the first period of American history, unquote. With the closure of the frontier as part of the frontier thesis, the thesis is as much about periodization as about the American character. Turner says that the first period of American history is over, meaning that the second period of American history is beginning, or was beginning in his time. And as much as the closure of the frontier was about the division between the first and second periods of history, it was also about the division between the American West and the Eastern Seaboard. This is another theme to which Turner returns repeatedly, emphasizing the difference between a frontier sweeping over the continent and the settled cities of the Eastern Seaboard. For example, quote, the West, as a phase of social organization, began with the Atlantic coast and passed across the continent, but the colonial tidewater area was in close touch with the Old World and soon lost its Western aspects, unquote. And, quote, the Atlantic coast was in such close touch with Europe that its frontier experience was soon counteracted and it developed along other lines, unquote. Here we can see the unfolding of the frontier as an historical process, and the closing of the frontier as a consequent historical process that was first experienced on the eastern seaboard and only much later came to the American plains. And when the closure of the frontier came to the west, it had a different character. The eastern seaboard had its strong commercial ties to Europe that drew it into the orbit of what's sometimes called Atlanticism, and this is something that's entirely foreign to the American West. Atlanticism has its center outside America, providing a template for the development of the Atlantic seaboard, but the American frontier is distinctively American, and it had to draw on its own resources when its seemingly endless expanses were finally exhausted. Turner wrote, quote, in the remoter West, the restless, rushing wave of settlement has broken with a shock against the arid plains. The free lands are gone, the continent is crossed, and all this push and energy is turning into channels of agitation. Failures in one area can no longer be made good by taking up land on a new frontier. The conditions of a settled society are being reached with suddenness and with confusion, unquote. Turner's frontier thesis was enormously influential, and as such, it became a lightning rod for criticism. If you look up books about the frontier thesis, you're as likely to find a volume that's hostile to Turner as one that's sympathetic. In particular, the frontier thesis has come to be associated with the ideas of American exceptionalism on the one hand and manifest destiny on the other. The origin of the idea of American exceptionalism is sometimes credited to Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote in Democracy in America, quote, the position of the Americans is therefore quite exceptional, and it may be believed that no democratic people will ever be placed in a similar one. Their strictly puritanical origin, their exclusively commercial habits, even the country they inhabit, which seems to focus their minds on the pursuit of science, literature, and the arts, the proximity of Europe, which allows them to sometimes neglect these pursuits without relapsing into barbarism, 1,000 special causes, of which I have only been able to point out the most important, have singularly concurred to fix the mind of the American upon purely practical objects, unquote. So de Tocqueville singled out three sources of American exceptionalism. It's true he did say there were 1,000 special causes, but he particularly notes three of them: Puritanism, commercial habits, and the country, that is to say, the landscape of America. But Turner wrote, as I previously quoted, that the American character was not carried in the Sarah Constant to Virginia, nor in the Mayflower to Plymouth. Puritanism was carried to America. It was a transplant from Europe. So Turner has already rejected this. And the strong distinction that Turner made between the eastern seaboard, with its close connections to Europe, and the western frontier point to the commercial habits being primarily cultivated in the cities of the eastern seaboard. The only thing that Turner and de Tocqueville have in common, then, is the role in the country in the shaping of the American character, and de Tocqueville laid no great emphasis on this, although one could argue that it's implicit throughout Democracy in America. So that's a pretty slim basis on which to connect Turner to American exceptionalism if we accept de Tocqueville's account of what makes America exceptional. And of course, we're under no obligation to do so. Every people, of course, has a myth of its own exceptionality, and in this sense, America is no exception to the rule. Turner didn't himself refer to American exceptionalism as far as I've found, but he did use manifest destiny once in The Frontier in American History, where he wrote, quote, the Western man believed in the manifest destiny of his country. On his border and checking his advance were the Indian, the Spaniard, and the Englishman. He was indignant at Eastern indifference and lack of sympathy with his view of these relations to these peoples, at the short-sightedness of Eastern policy. Unquote. This passage doesn't have any special prominence, and it seems to me to be more of a reiteration of the divide between the western frontier and the eastern seaboard than an endorsement of an ideology of manifest destiny. And as with exceptionalism, there's nothing unique about the idea of a people having a manifest destiny. The idea of a civilizing mission can be found in the Spanish, Portuguese, and French, none of which are considered especially close to the English tradition from which America received its political traditions. The geographical dimensions of that destiny are different in each case, but that seems unavoidable. When and where a people establishes itself as a force in history will determine the scope and scale of its destiny. Returning to the idea of American exceptionalism, there's another important aspect to me that seems to me to be more interesting. One can't consistently argue for the frontier thesis together with American exceptionalism at the same time as one is arguing that the frontier thesis has applications to other times and places. If the frontier thesis applies generally, and America is one instance of the frontier thesis, but not the only instance of the frontier thesis, then by definition, the American experience isn't exceptional. Turner doesn't develop the frontier thesis as a general thesis about history, apart from the American West, but he hints pretty clearly at this. Quote, "In spite of environment and in spite of custom, each frontier did indeed furnish a new field of opportunity, a gate of escape from the bondage of the past, and freshness and confidence and scorn of older society, impatience of its restraints and its ideas, and indifference to its lessons have accompanied the frontier. What the Mediterranean Sea was to the Greeks, breaking the bond of custom, offering new experiences, calling out new institutions and activities, that and more, the ever-retreating frontier has been to the United States directly and to the nations of Europe more remotely." Unquote. To refer to each frontier clearly implies that there's been more than one, and he even mentions the Mediterranean as the frontier of the Greeks and an experience of the frontier in the remote past of European history. I wanted to draw attention to the relative uniqueness or generality of the frontier thesis because in my episode on Geoffrey Elton, I discussed Elton's distinction between what he called thesis-dominated history and thesis-free or empirical history. Elton was concerned to skewer the legitimacy of thesis-dominated history and to defend the honor of thesis-free history as the only legitimate form of historical understanding. Elton wrote, quote, "I am confining the term history to one of two disciplines that can lay claim to it. These two I may call thesis empirical or thesis-free, and determinist or thesis-dominated. By thesis, I here mean a general scheme of interpretation regarded as universally applicable, as derived from laws discoverable in the historical process, and as possessed of powers of prediction." Unquote. Elton recognized the legitimacy of theses that are formulated to cover a single instance, so he doesn't completely reject an historian maintaining a thesis, but he does reject the generalization of historical theses to multiple instances. Elton says that his exception for a singular thesis in history is, quote, "limited to the single problem for which it is constructed and has no power to predict. Insofar as it employs alleged general laws, these are loose and large views of human behavior derived from experience and devoid of that normative power which a law must possess to deserve the name." Unquote. Now, I've characterized Turner's position as being focused on the frontier thesis in American history, but hinting at its applicability to other contexts. So is Turner's account of the American West embodying the frontier thesis, an instance of thesis-dominated history? There's a sense in which Turner's work is dominated by the frontier thesis, but in another sense, he's entirely concerned with the American West. So I don't think we can say that Turner's work is dominated by a general conception of the frontier thesis that's forcing the events of American history into a pattern imposed from above, rather than allowing the facts of empirical history to speak for themselves from below. So I would concede to Elton that there's a theoretical component to the frontier thesis, and that it can be generalized to other instances of frontiers. But whether Turner's generalization exceeds the threshold that Elton has defined isn't clear to me. But it does seem that what we can see with historical theses are gradations of generality. So is there any lesson to be learned from other well-known historical theses? In my episode on A.J.P. Taylor, I discussed his Nuremberg thesis, as well as the idea of a Sonderweg, that is to say, a special path of development that characterized Germany, and which also can be called an historical thesis, the Sonderweg thesis, if you like. These seem to be very specific to a particular milieu and don't admit of any appreciable generalization. And the very idea of a special path of development for a single people is by its very nature resistant to generalization. However, insofar as the Sonderweg thesis implies that there is a generic template of development that applies to all peoples not distinguished by the Sonderweg, the complement of the Sonderweg thesis implies a generalizable thesis, but Taylor doesn't even mention this, so it's not any part of his argument, though I did note that in my episode on Taylor. In my episode on Henri Pirenne, I discussed the Pirenne thesis, according to which the end of classical antiquity is marked not by the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, but rather by the rise of Islam in the East, which deprived the empire of some of its wealthiest and most populous centers. I don't know of anyone who's tried to generalize the Pirenne thesis, so it remains highly specific and well within Elton's threshold of acceptable generalization without predictive power. I don't think anybody's going to say that we can predict from the Pirenne thesis what will happen when the next great collapse of civilization happens. So why would Pirenne even bother to express his view as the Pirenne thesis? I think it's because there have been so many different arguments made for the end of classical antiquity and the beginning of the Middle Ages that each attempt to explain this transition needs to be distinguished by a name of its own. And the power of the Pirenne thesis isn't that it can be generalized to other cases, but that rather it can collect within itself a mass of evidence into a single coherent explanatory structure. So in addition to there being degrees of the generalizability of an historical thesis, there's also the possibility of qualitatively distinct kinds of generalization of an historical thesis. Pirenne's thesis is general in terms of covering, under one idea, a large number of historical facts contributing to a single interpretation of the transition of ancient to medieval history, but not in the sense of being applicable to other times and places. In my episode on Herbert Eugene Bolton, and Bolton was a student of Turner, I discussed the Bolton thesis, according to which American history ought properly to be Western hemispherical history. Again, I don't know of any attempts to generalize the Bolton thesis, although in my episode on it, I suggested that it has a place within a generalized structure in which, in the pursuit of greater and greater historical context, we continually expand the scope of our historical inquiry from local circumstances to geographical regions, to continents, to hemispheres, and then ultimately to the world entire. If this then counts as a generalization, then the Bolton thesis also courts generalization, but I don't think there's any possible prediction to be derived except as it might apply to some other species on some other planet. Once we've exhausted Earth as the scope of our human history, we can't really generalize to this structure unless we generalize to another planet. And it's at this point, I think, that we find what's most interesting in the implications of the frontier thesis. We've become accustomed to thinking of space as the final frontier. And if it is, then the frontier thesis, or what we can extract as the general essence of the frontier thesis from the particularities of Turner's exposition in relation to the American West, could it possibly have the kind of predictive power that would mark off the frontier thesis as exceeding Elton's threshold of acceptable generalizations for historical theses? Of course, Turner never suggested anything like this, even though he suggested that there were other frontiers and other frontier experiences in the human past. Probably Turner didn't project the frontier thesis into the future, but it's hard to resist that implication now. We are at present in an historical, unprecedented situation where there are no frontiers remaining anywhere on the planet, and every nation state is girded by legally defined boundaries. We are all of us hemmed in with no place to turn. But if we can master the technology of space exploration, then we will open up a new frontier, and the pioneer spirit can once again play out against a new backdrop under new historical circumstances and with distinct historical precursors. So there's enough there to make it distinctive, but there's also enough there to make it reflect earlier instances of the frontier in human history. This is an idea that deserves further elaboration, whether or not it's examined from the perspective of Turner's frontier thesis, but obviously it certainly wouldn't hurt to read Turner before embarking on a speculative inquiry into whether a space frontier would imply something for the future of human history. Even the idea that we're in an unprecedented historical situation at present because there are no more frontiers on Earth is itself a claim of a planetary scale closing of the frontier. And here again, Turner can be our guide. So happy birthday, Frederick Jackson Turner, and thanks for listening.